Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Alyssa Polizzi.
And I'm Arran Rogerson.
And today we're discussing the myth of the flood, one of the most prevalent motifs that we see across cultures. It explores the archetypal dynamics of chaos and complexity, the destructive and cleansing force of nature and God that reveals our weaknesses and blind spots, while paving the way for rebirth and redemption.
So the flood is present on multiple levels of reality. There is a history of the flood as a symbol in our mythology, almost as a universal symbol. It seems to come up in a lot of different cultures. There's this notion of the creation myth that is associated with the flood. There's looking at the flood as just a catastrophe or disaster when something goes horribly wrong or something comes along and just destroys everything. Right. There's also a feeling of revolution or rebirth. There's what comes into being after everything has been destroyed or washed away. And there's also just this notion of in our individual lives, in our society, is sometimes things go wrong and things fall apart.
Yeah. Sometimes
things happen to you that sort of strip away a lot of what was superficial and leaves behind only what is really deep, what matters.
Yeah.
What's grounded. So there's a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of different dimensions that we can be looking at this concept of the flood. And maybe the best place to start is with the mythology.
Yeah, I think that's a nice place to start because it certainly lays down a framework where we recognize that in all different cultures, different times, we see this evolution of a kind of collective experience that's been mythologized and kind of lifted up into this national story that has survived to the modern day for us to be able to compare and amplify against one another. I mean, one of the most popular biblical stories, of course, is Noah and the flood. Right. But that has pretty direct ties to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Mesopotamian flood story. We see a very similar story in Greek mythology with Deucalion as well. In addition, you see it popping up in lots of other areas. Native Americans have some flood myth stories, South America. So there's something going on here, something that's being tapped into in the collective consciousness that seems to speak to some experience, not just, I don't know, realistically, because obviously natural disasters do happen and that might have been woven into the mythology, but there's something else that's happening on a psychological level as well.
Right. With all these, I mean, virtually everything that we've discussed on this podcast, we're always trying to examine the fact that there's some sort of material, real thing at play here. And there's also our psychological relationship with the material thing. And in terms of the flood myth, let's say, the fact that it's universal might be because there is a universal experience of disasters and things going wrong. And there might even be a universal experience of a literal flood that most ancient peoples have experienced. But beyond that, it's not just the flood. It could be a sickness. It could be a famine. It could even be a drought, the opposite of a flood. It's like when something demolishes our structures. If everyone is starving to death because there's a drought, in some sense, it's like, why has this been cast upon us, this terrible event or experience? But beyond that, there's also the psychology, the universal psychology, and we're all human, so we all have a similar way of looking at the world, of navigating the world, of modeling what's happening to us. And there is a shared psychology of what you do when things fall apart and how you even frame problems as far as, do I need to prepare for a problem that hasn't even happened yet? And that's a very conscious thing. You don't see animals doing that quite as much, even though there's definitely examples. But the fact that humans say, maybe winter is coming and I need to prepare for winter is a weird idea. It's like I'm preparing for something that might happen months from now, years from now. I don't know, but it's important in the back of my mind to be prepared for that. And that's a distinctly human and a universal human psychology, I would say.
In a lot of the variants of the flood myth, we see that the dynamic that sort of causes or triggers the flood often has a lot to do with some sort of action behavior that's been taken by mankind at that time that's been judged as not good enough,
Right.
sinful at times, barbaric, violent, disturbing the kind of natural order in some way.
Yeah.
So we see that in like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where I believe like the humans have become too noisy. They're disturbing the gods. We have the Genesis flood myth, where, you know, God feels like individuals and humans have become corrupt and filled with violence.
Yeah.
In the Greek flood myth, we have Zeus, who's no longer happy with the Bronze Age and wants to like wipe out all of humanity. So with each of these dynamics, we're seeing that some sort of universal force, something outside of the human scope, has judged humankind in some way to be no longer worthy of walking the land, and something has to be done about it.
Right. There's this association with higher power, gods. Gods are a universal thing that ancient peoples had some sort of notion of a power that must be negotiated with in some way. And if you negotiate poorly, like if you don't behave properly, you get punished for it. And so the flood definitely taps into this, is that there's some way that humans have been behaving, something they've been doing that's not right.
Yeah.
And they have to pay the price now. And that's, I think, sounds like a silly idea to some people who are examining it at a very shallow level, but this is, you know, just a truth of our experience, that if you don't behave properly, bad things will happen to you. If you don't wear a seatbelt while you're driving, it's easy to say, well, I'm fine, I never get in an accident, so there's no reason to wear a seatbelt. And someone might say, well, God will smite you if you don't wear a seatbelt. But like, there's a truth to that, because it's like, if you don't wear a seatbelt, when you actually do crash, eventually you'll die, and you'll pay for not having worn a seatbelt. So there's this at play in reality, and this is definitely something that's being dramatized in these myths for the early humans, which is there's a way to act in the world where things tend to work out well for us.
Yeah.
And there's a way to act in the world where things tend to work out poorly.
Yeah.
And it's almost like someone is watching your actions and then making decisions based on them.
Yeah.
Whether you did well, or whether you did poorly. Maybe like Santa Claus, were you naughty or were you nice?
It's true.
Are you going to get presents for being naughty or nice? And so we can see this clearly presenting itself universally.
You know, I find it interesting, especially with the three main flood myths that I've mentioned, that there's this very similar structure where we have the scene being set, you know, with that higher power, some sort of god, and their feeling of, you know, wanting to kind of cleanse the land and the earth due to sin, due to, you know, mankind not really living up to what, at least the potential or the principles that God feels like they should be living to. And so through this, you know, we're bringing about chaos and disorder and destruction that's ultimately leading to a new creation myth.
Right.
Because once everything is wiped clean, what happens? But each of these kind of myth heroes is tasked with, you know, setting the space for things to be regenerated. So they're both myths of destruction and creation at the same time.
Right. And those two things are related.
Yeah.
Obviously, and we've talked about this quite a bit, I think, already. But this notion that destruction paves the way for creation, and that washing away is part of the creative process. And that's sort of counterintuitive. It's like, how is destruction part of the creative process?
Yeah.
It's like, well, you generate all this material, and that's sort of how to phrase this. You generate a bunch of material, and then you need to edit it down. And if you're a writer, for instance, or anyone who composes things, you understand this thing where it's like you generate a lot of material. You write and write and write. There's all these notes, but you're not done. Like, okay, I finished the book. I just wrote for 20 days straight. It's like, no, you probably just have a mess of notes, and now you need to somehow edit those notes to take the form that you want. You sculpt them, and so there's this process of generation, and then there's sort of like editing, generation, editing, and the flood is sort of this notion of like there's all this mess that's been generated, and the flood comes and it sort of edits that mess almost, and that sculpts the world into the way maybe it ought to be, causing some sort of revolution, causing a sort of new order to emerge.
Yeah.
And it depends. I mean, there's also just the flood that just like totally screws everything up, and you never recover from it. And that happens to people.
Yes.
But that's not really what's being depicted in this mythology.
No, not exactly in these stories, because they do lead to the new order being established, where whoever we're following in the story, that kind of cultural myth hero is now being given a path towards helping the world kind of come back to life. But why are these individuals chosen, I think, is an interesting question. Why is Noah chosen? Why is Deucalion chosen? What's going on here? What makes them different than everyone else who was populating the earth at that time? And often what we see is that there's some element of connection to that God figure that makes them either favored by God or at least in some way reachable to the from that kind of God consciousness into the human form, and they're given instructions of how to get through the flood. And with Noah, the idea is that he walks with God. And so he's been kind of, you might say, this like God-fearing man who's been living in accordance with the reality that God wants him to live by. And because of that, there's something deep in his psyche that tells him, you need to build the ark, you need to get the animals, you need to get your family. So symbolically, you see that deep, higher conscious as being able to prepare him for what's to come. With the Greek myth, we have Deucalion, who's the son of Prometheus. And it's Prometheus who kind of comes in and says, you have to build this chest and you and your wife are going to get in it. And you guys are going to like float across, the flood, and eventually, you'll survive it. So
interesting.
And similar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we see the flood myth. There's also a boat that's built, and that comes from this other god coming in and saying, to survive this, you need to build this boat. So we have these things that are kind of translated over to each of these heroes, and it's because they have some sort of dynamic connection to that God principle. Maybe you might, relate that to kind of having themselves more grounded in reality, more connected to deeper levels of consciousness even, that allow them to sense the coming storm and prepare, maybe just having a greater awareness of how to be more grounded in what reality is, which is that you can't just pretend that nothing bad is ever going to happen. In fact, you have to prepare. You have to build the ark even when the rain clouds aren't overhead.
Right. So this structure that we're seeing, at least in these three myths, and we're just going to stick with three myths for now because we don't want to turn this into a 2-hour podcast. But the flood is water specifically. Why water? Right?
Well, yeah. Such a powerful symbol.
Yeah. I mean, the ocean, the sea.
Yeah.
There's all this symbolic depth to it, and you can make sense why, just sort of like visually, sort of like materially, it's like the water is being something that is sort of mysterious, and if there's a great amount of water, you can't see below it, but it's also the source of life.
Yes.
It's something that's always sort of raging. As far as the ocean and the sea goes, there's mystery of like what's beyond the ocean, but it's also this feeling of chaos.
Yes.
Right, chaos and life at the same time, which is a strange combination. But you can understand why early humans and animals, for that matter, would have such a strong association with water as this thing that you are searching for to survive. But like, don't fall in.
Right.
Or you'll drown. And it's like, that's a weird combination of ideas of like, it's a source of life, but it's also dangerous.
Well, it's a really prevalent symbol that usually represents the unconscious. And we see it in dreams, in stories, certainly in myth, as representing that highly dynamic, complex nature of the creative and destructive force, that which breeds life and that which takes life. It's like the symbol of the Ouroboros as well, I feel, where it's like this cyclical pattern of that which we are born from, yet at the same time where we return to.
Right.
So there's this eerie, unknown, mysterious, dark depths to the floodwaters. It's not just like a little lake, right? It's evoking something powerful, a natural force, something that can come in and crash and just totally cleanse the land. So in that same way, when we consider the dynamics of the unconscious and how the floodwaters of our own psyche can just spill over
Yeah.
and take control and leave us feeling completely lost and
Right.
ungrounded or drowning even.
Sure.
I think that's why we have seen the development of that watery ocean element as being so powerfully representative of that which is a part of us, yet we cannot control.
Right. So the unconscious, I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at this. And something else that's important to acknowledge is that these myths that are emerging, this is sort of before what we think of as modern consciousness.
Sure.
You might say.
Yes,
It's
yes.
like
Yeah,
it's easy to think, well, people 3,000 years ago, they had conversations like Alyssa and I are having now, right? They just talk to each other about stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's probably not really true.
Maybe the ancient Greeks.
Maybe, but even then, it's like you have to understand that our language has evolved in such a way that we have all these words that articulate these very deep meanings, and there's a very literal sort of materialist approach that we have now to reality, thanks to science, of like making sense of what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
But in the past, they're essentially just intuiting these images. It's just sort of this drama that
Yes,
emerges.
yes.
And it's not just like, well, why did you write that? It's like, oh, well, I wrote this because obviously the ocean represents the unconscious. It's like people 3,000 years ago they have no idea what they're doing even.
Right,
They're
yes.
just sort of giving birth to these things, and they evolve on their own. And you tell a story to someone and they retell the story,
Yes.
and other people retell the story, and the story spreads. And as it spreads, people do a better job of telling it, or the person who tells the good story passes on the story because people want to hear the good
Yes.
story. The person who does a bad job telling the story, and they add a little spin off like, oh, and like, Noah had 6 arms for some reason. It's like, that might not get passed on. It's like, why? It's like, because it doesn't make sense in the story. So no one's going to
Right.
retell it with 6 arms, but they might stick with the arc as like, yes, that's a powerful symbol. We like that.
Yeah.
So stories have a life of their own. They evolve over time, but a lot of these myths, they're just being dramatized.
Yeah.
They're not being like very consciously written because they very specifically want to evoke this specific thing. They're just sort of coming into being. And so the ocean as something that is intuited, water as something that's intuited. There is, water is what carved the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Yes.
It has this incredibly powerful force to shape the world.
Sure.
If you're living someplace where there are seasons, there are crazy floods that happen, and they do come around. And they might come around every year, and they just destroy things.
Yeah. Yeah. Flash floods.
Flash floods, and like the rivers rising up like very high all of a sudden. And that's something that would have definitely been on a lot of people's minds, of the possibility of this thing happening. But there is also this notion of chaos that's a psychological thing, where if you're damming a river, for instance, you are in some sense holding back the waters. And that's very similar to how our psychology works often, is the unconscious is being held back by these barriers.
Interesting. Yeah.
And we hold the water back because why? It's like, because we can't handle all the water at once.
Yeah.
We have to keep it controlled and contained. And if you find yourself having a panic attack, for instance, there is some notion of like, you've broken the dam.
Yeah.
The waters are flowing in, and you are just going to be totally submerged in chaos.
Yeah.
Overwhelmed with all the contents of your unconscious, and it's like water rushing in and drowning you. And another way to think about it is there's this something that happens when things fall apart in your life. And again, this is talking about the flood as like a disaster. It's also tapping into this notion of the tarot card, the Tower.
Yes.
Right? It's like disaster strikes, or things go wrong. And there's an experience in your life where it's like things can collapse in a very just psychological way.
And in a very sudden way.
In a very sudden way,
Yes.
yeah. But it doesn't necessarily need to be material.
No.
For instance, if this is a cliche example, but if you find out that your partner has been cheating on you,
Yeah.
there's a collapse that happens there. And it's just like, suddenly you don't know what's real anymore. Your life's a lie. This whole notion of like, my life has been a lie. It's like, what's happening? It's like, you've fallen from a place of like dry land where you feel secure. And you've fallen into the ocean of chaos. And now you're just like drowning, and you're just like, I have no idea what's real anymore. I can't make sense of my life. What the hell am I going to do?
Right.
Same thing might happen if you lose your job and you like have no other options. It's like suddenly you've fallen into the ocean of chaos. You're overwhelmed by unmapped territory, and you're just drowning in all this essentially just like unexplored information. You haven't mapped it out. And that's this feeling of the water coming in and rushing in, pouring into your life.
Right. That's the feeling of the flood, or when the tower falls, that it brings you back to this undifferentiated chaos.
Right.
The depths of the unconscious realm where you have not sorted through things, and you do not know which way to go or how to rebuild or what any of this means. And that brings such an incredible destabilizing force that it feels like everything has crumbled. You know, what's interesting about the tower, just as a symbol and as an archetype, is that when it collapses, when this catastrophic event happens, you're usually able to look back and see how compromised the structure always was, or maybe how it had been failing over time. Yet you hadn't been paying attention, or you'd been ignoring it, denying it, just wanting to push it out of your sphere of responsibility and awareness and just pretend it away. But those things always boomerang back to you. So the tower is often, it's like, this could be something that you just could have never seen coming. And this is just kind of a Wheel of Fortune, I would say, actually. Go listen to that episode. That's when things happen. It's like, man, why? Like, what can you even connect this to? But that's why it's different in the tarot, right? It's like, well, we've got the wheel to kind of encompass those experiences that just happen, and its fate and its destiny. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, whatever. But the tower, there's something at play here that those bricks have been built by your hands, and not just your hands, other people's, right? In connection to others, you've built towers, or internal sort of psychic towers, you know, the foundations of your own emotionality. But something has been breaking down for some time, and finally it collapses. And what do you do as you stand in the destruction of that scene? What do you realize? What comes to light? What is the revelation? And often it's that something needed to be changed in the first place, and now the destructive force has kind of taken it upon its hand to rip down that structure, and now it's time to move forward.
Right. So this another aspect of this dynamic is what you're saying is that the lack of preparation, the cracks in your structure that you are not paying attention to. I mean, again, the flood, you could interpret this even, just totally literally. It's like, are you prepared for the flood? And let's say you're an early human and you just have all this grain that you've been harvesting, and you've been harvesting it all summer, and you just got it all piled up in this like really safe spot, and you're just like, good, I'm set for the winter. And then this like surprise storm comes through, and the grain's all washed away, and you're just like, oh, I'm gonna die now. Like, whoops, I should not have just left the grain out like that. I should have found a way to put it in some kind of container or elevate it somehow, or I don't even know, but like, I'm dead now. That's serious shit, is that like all my food got washed away.
Right. So often in like mythology or even folklore, we kind of see like woven into these stories, how do you say, like tenets of how to be, ways to survive, practical advice,
It's very survival oriented.
Yeah, survival oriented.
And it's not just survival of the individual. You can check out my series, The Torch, if you want to explore this more. But survival of the tribe, survival of your lineage. A lot of the preparation you're doing in this lifetime is for your children's well-being, not necessarily your own. So, anyways, a lot of these myths, everything early on, and we tend to forget this because we just think of life in the context of our own modern lifestyle of like, what's important? It's like, oh, having fun and feeling good. But like, all of this is survival oriented.
Right. Yeah.
Survival of the tribe. And so a lot of these myths, a lot of these stories, they're pointing at strategies, just sort of tips almost for like how the tribe can survive and the things that you need to do in order for the tribe to survive. And that's what God wants from you.
Yes, that reminds me in the Mesopotamian, myth and the flood myth here. I'm going to totally butcher his name. Utnapishtim. That's like his name. It's not actually Gilgamesh. It's another guy.
That sounds
Anyways,
pretty good.
he's tasked, by the god to create the ship, and it's called the Preserver of Life.
Right.
So it's really, to me, evoking that feeling of passing on the torch or holding like the seed of creation, because despite God or some gods being angry and wanting to destroy the world, or those who inhabit it, there's still a sense that life can continue should it maybe shift a little bit, maybe evolve to kind of get back into some sort of more balanced relationship with reality.
Right.
So that preserver of life, building our ark, our ship, the chest of possibility, that takes us through the flood is that which is the preserver of the future generations of culture and community to survive, for family and lineage to keep growing. It's absolutely necessary on this deeply instinctual level, as well on this more heartfelt human connective dynamic. It's like we must learn from our parents. We need to learn from the elders. What does it take to survive in this land? What does it take to survive into the future? Otherwise, we're caught in a cycle where we're just barely getting by, and humans are just built to be like evolutionary powerhouses, you know, and the stories reflect that.
Definitely. And so you can relate this notion of needing to prepare, or of the cracks in the foundation being revealed by the flood, to the current moment, I would say. The pandemic, again, is a good manifestation of this flood archetype, of something that comes along, and for at least for the individual, just like at the localized level, it's like you have no control over this. It's like it just has arrived and it's totally thrown your life for a loop. A lot of people have been seriously just destroyed by the pandemic.
Impacted in ways that just echo into all these areas of life.
Right. I mean, people who are working, for instance, like in like the entertainment or service industry, especially, it's just like your job's gone. And the response is, well, how long is it gone? It's like, we don't know, maybe a year or two. It's like, what the hell am I supposed to do in the meantime? But it's just, again, it's like the person with the grain, and the flood comes along and washes it all away. It's like, oh, my food's gone. It's like the pandemic comes along and now your job's gone. And it's like the same equivalent. It's like the same thing. Like, I lost my source for survival. What the hell am I going to do? And it's like, there is, in some sense, it's like, well, you should have been prepared for this.
Well, right. The question is like, well, did you have an emergency fund?
Right. Did you save up money just in case you ever lost your job? Do you have any backup vocational stuff that you can rely upon? And it's not fair to say, well, if you are messed up by the pandemic, it's your fault. It's like, it's not
Certainly
really what
not.
we're saying.
Definitely
not saying this is a very, very weird occurrence. I mean, how could you prepare for this? Even if you knew it was coming, even if someone told you, hey, 5 years from now, this is going to happen, like, you still wouldn't really be prepared for what this is, because you can't know what's going to happen. But still, the pandemic is a good example of it washes away a lot of the things that aren't grounded very well. And a lot of things that are grounded really well remain. And you can see it in like relationships. A lot of the relationships that you might have that are actually pretty superficial, they're shallow, they might even be pretty narcissistic, by which I mean like the relationship is just completely founded on like pleasure-seeking activity, and that's
self-serving.
Those relationships just fall away in a situation like this, and they probably have. And for a lot of you listening, it's like, what are the relationships you've maintained in this situation? It's like, I bet the ones that are actually really strong and solid and were really based on reliability, truth, on respect, those relationships are probably strengthened right now, or at least they haven't disappeared because of this. And probably a lot of the relationships you had that actually weren't really based on much accountability or honesty, or respect, a lot of those relationships probably have just washed away. Because they weren't that important to begin with. And that's what the flood does. The things that really either don't matter or they're not strong, those get washed away. And there's problems with that, because a lot of what gets washed away is actually really useful to you and you need it. And that sucks. And it would have been nice if you were more prepared for it. But at the same time, it's also an opportunity because it washes away a lot of things that maybe shouldn't have been there to begin with. And if you have relationships, for instance, that actually weren't very strong, they were pretty superficial, and the pandemic came and washed them away, maybe they weren't worthwhile to begin with.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of your activities that you were engaged in weren't worthwhile to begin with. And maybe you've stopped doing some of those things in favor of a more spiritual pursuit of making sense of who you are and kind of like what's real, and maybe a sense that the world is actually in trouble and really needs you. That might have entered into your life during this time. And the flood has that effect.
Yeah. The flood hero is a hero. So there's some there's some evoking of that archetypal consciousness that requires us to step up and to kind of raise the standards of our own being, to kind of leave the safety of where we've been, to face chaos, to have courage, to be humble, to recognize our foolishness and our weaknesses and our blind spots, but to not succumb to that, but instead to sort of strengthen and then to accept guidance, whether that comes from, like the wise teacher who's kind of coming in, trying to guide, the hero forward, or the God in the sky who speaks to you and says, this is how you'll survive this.
Yeah.
The hero recognizes that he doesn't have all the answers, that they don't exactly know how to move forward and how to develop. And yet there is the feeling that you're going to be able to do it. You're going to figure it out. And through that process, you leave certain things behind just naturally, so the hero does leave the hometown where everything's kind of easy and things are just sort of flowing for something greater. And so when these really kind of powerful events take place, whether it's as catastrophic as the flood, or maybe this sort of, new, exciting, adventurous opportunity that's opening up, we have to embrace the potential of what the hero really offers to us. And that requires that we do really look around and see what doesn't fit anymore, who we're kind of defining ourselves at this moment, which is actually possibly a version that's limited.
Right. So in these stories, the hero is an interesting aspect of this. It's like the hero is warned.
Yes.
And that's sort of interesting. It's like he's told, like, hey, this is going to happen. You need to prepare for this.
Yeah.
Which is a little different than like, well, the hero just like finds a way to defeat the flood.
Right. The flood has started and he's just building a boat and getting the animals
Or he
on.
just like punches the flood and it like goes away or something like that. It's like there's a lot of stories like that where it's like the flood happens and like the hero just solves it.
Right.
But like in these stories, it's like, no, the hero doesn't solve it.
Yeah, no, it's a very different type of hero.
All he can do is survive
Yes.
while everyone else dies.
Yes.
And it's an interesting story. And it's like, can you imagine like one of our like Marvel movies like having this plot? Where it's like Iron Man, like Thanos is coming. It's like, what should I do? It's like, Iron Man, just build a rocket ship and fly away.
Right.
It's like, what? Why is he running away? And it's like, well, these myths are depicting something that's like, sometimes you can't stop this.
Yeah.
The flood is coming, and it's like, good luck overpowering the flood. And that is how life often is. And again, talking about like the Wheel of Fortune, like fate. Things are going to go wrong, and maybe there's nothing you can do about it. Like, what could you have solved the pandemic? No, not really. But could you prepare for it in some way?
Yeah. It's interesting, if we're thinking about very classic hero archetype as that adventure and this very external action-oriented kind of picking up the sword and fighting the dragon, defeating, taking on the challenges, punching the flood, as you say, which is ridiculous.
That'll work,
but
right?
Even just you saying that makes me think of those very classic heroes. Like, what does Hercules do? Like, how does he like overcome nearly all of his trials? It's like he's gonna strong arm it. Like he's gonna figure out how to kill the Hydra, right? But these flood myth heroes have a different relationship to the challenge that's happening. And they're also like nurturing and holding on to something that's kind of been given to them from God, from this powerful universal force. And so in some ways, maybe I'll throw out this question to you, Arran. Is it a feminine hero, these flood myths that we see? Like Noah is holding all of the potentials of life. He's gestating that on the ark, and they protect it, or he's holding it in some way, right? He's got the seed of life. maybe we have like a double kind of masculine, feminine going on. This is where things obviously are not black and
Yeah.
white, but
I mean, it's never black and white.
No.
And there's always a masculine and feminine going on in everyone and in everything. And depends how you look at it. The masculine and feminine question is one that's like always kind of like, well, you could just flip it on its head and see it as masculine, or you could flip it again and see it as feminine, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah.
I do think that the sort of notion of like protecting something within you, like protecting again, like a torch that you need to carry. And that's like a very feminine thing. It's like sort of like carrying what is most important inside of you and getting it to safety somehow and raising it up and nurturing it. It's like a very feminine journey. That's like almost like the heroine's journey. Honestly, is sort of like giving birth and protecting the child.
And it's also often one of diplomacy rather than fighting that we see with the typical masculine hero. So there is like this diplomatic thing that's happening between them and these God figures, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, Noah, you walk with God, you've kind of proven yourself, like this is what you need to do. And it's like, okay, so I'll do this. It's like, yes. And then God kind of forgets about him and he floats around. But eventually it's like, oh yeah, Noah on the ark with all the animals and his family. It's like, okay. And now you kind of move out and you've been holding all of these, as I said, like these seeds, these potentials for life to be resown and born again. And you see that with these three main flood myths as well, like Deucalion and his wife actually, are given they choose to repopulate mankind. And so they throw these like stones over their back, and every stone that Deucalion throws over his shoulder turns into a man, and his wife throws the stones over her shoulder and they become women. And so they start to repopulate. So
right, they build a new world.
Yeah, they build the new world. So there's a very interesting dynamic that's going on there, where we're kind of sort of dancing between the worlds of the courageous typical hero and that of the heroine's journey as well.
Yeah, it's a much more cosmic hero's journey, almost one of like you're charged with rebuilding the world.
Yeah,
it's like that's pretty heavy.
Super
and like
heavy.
we don't really see that necessarily in the typical hero's journey myth that we discuss. Though there is, of course, the notion of like navigating chaos and bringing about a new order that the hero is always engaged in, where you defeat Sauron and you conquer the chaos of Sauron and you create a new order and you save the world in that sense. But this is almost like the world is being destroyed and you are charged with not being destroyed and carrying the light to the new world where you will rebuild it out of the corpse of the old one. Yeah, which is it's a little more heavy, a little more cosmic.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in the Greek myth, either like Zeus or like an oracle tells him that to repopulate the world, you have to throw the bones of your mother behind your shoulder, and then they try to think about what that means, and they relate that to the goddess Gaia, aka Mother Earth. So they pick up the stones. Yeah. So from the skeleton, literally, of her being, they rebuild. So
right. So that's again tapping into this kind of this huge source of meaning. I think for people in general is the hero's journey. Right. It's like confronting the chaos of the world, venturing into it. Having the courage to venture into that chaos and trying to bring some order to that chaos. Yeah. Trying to construct some sort of habitable order for the people that you love, for yourself. And that there's a great deal of meaning that if you actually take on the responsibility of doing this, your life will be more meaningful. If you're willing to, in some sense, confront the flood and navigate through it on a boat and make it to the new world, that's an incredibly meaningful thing to do that you would want to do. So there's like that aspect of it. There's Noah as this hero who needs to build a new world. But I think this is universal. This is always true. But I mean, especially right now, I feel like people should be able to resonate with this feeling of like, maybe the world's ending. And maybe you as in you, like I'm talking to you, it's like you might have the responsibility for building the new world or making sure that the light doesn't go out, making sure the torch doesn't extinguish, and carrying the tradition of the old world or whatever you need to take from the old world, the corpse of the old world, the corpse of your parents, and you are responsible for building the new world. And a lot of people alive today, I think you'd probably find a lot of meaning in embodying that myth and saying, things are screwed up right now, and maybe it's up to me to kind of figure out how to make things not so screwed up.
Yeah.
And maybe the world, maybe it's about time for some sort of revolution of some kind. I think revolutions are a really dangerous thing to consider, but they're not always violent in some sense. There are revolutions that happen that can be really good. And there might be a time of revolution approaching in which like you are charged and I am charged and we're all charged in some sense with building the new world. And to take on that responsibility is something that's going to be a gigantic source of meaning. There's all these little mini floods that are going to happen in your life. And, you know, things like a breakup is like a mini flood in some kind of way. It's like your relationship collapses.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? You're going to build a new world out of the dead relationship. And you can expand that out and like, you know, you lose your job, you get in a car crash, maybe you get injured really badly. There's all these little things that happen to you where it's like that, okay, well that old world is over and the new world is now like it needs to begin, and you're responsible for building that new world. And that's really the journey of life, and that's really what meaning comes from. All right, for this dream portion of the podcast, we're going to examine one of Alyssa's dreams, and she regularly has dreams with floods or tidal waves or tsunamis.
Yeah, something like that.
Or storms or what else? Things having to do with the chaos of water.
Yeah, the chaos of water. Yeah, that's a good way to think it.
And this is one of those dreams.
Yes. I am walking through the town I live in. To my left is the ocean, and to the right, a park near my house. As I look across the beach, I am shocked to see that a large tidal wave appears to be hanging in midair, ready to crash down onto the shore. The water is filled with things, whales, fish, people. They are all suspended in the waves. The entire coast is like this, and I feel frightened. I turn to someone and ask them what happened. He says the city has been taking huge amounts of water out of the ocean, throwing off the natural balance. Tons of people are gathered on the beach, transfixed by the scene. I feel worried that the water will soon unfreeze and come crashing down to kill those gathered. No one seems to realize the danger, and the sense of terror heightens in me. I can't seem to get anyone to leave the beach, so I turn towards the park, knowing I need to move inland and east to safer ground.
How recently was this?
September 26th.
Okay, so pretty recently.
Yeah.
So, impending doom
Yeah.
in the form of water.
Yeah.
So the flood.
Right, the flood.
Essentially.
Yeah.
But taking the form of something a little more like magical and strange, right? Were you saying the water was frozen? And
yeah, well, actually the water was like moving. It's hard to explain it, but it's basically like as if this huge tidal wave was, like when a tsunami happens and the water sort of draws out, and as it comes, it's just like this giant wave that's curling down.
Yeah.
That's what it looked like. And it was hovering in air. So it wasn't in motion of crashing down onto the water. It was kind of suspended, frozen, but everything in like the water itself was still moving. Like everything was alive.
Yeah.
And there was like fish. I could see like the tail of a whale. There were like people as if they had been swimming in it. It's like really strange imagery, but they're all there. They're in the water still, but they're all kind of like frozen with the wave itself. So there's some really intense natural phenomena that's happening. Like this isn't just a normal wave, but it's all frozen in this moment, and I'm just staring at it. And so are all these people. So there's this incredible sense of doom and terror and just feeling really horrified, honestly, is like what the emotion was in the dream, and feeling like something is coming And people can kind of see it, yet at the same time, they don't seem to understand it the way I do.
Right. So there is just the moment, the lockdown, the pandemic, the election, potential for civil unrest,
Yeah.
uncertainty of the future. That's all at play here.
Certainly.
What else? What other context
Yeah.
for you?
This was right around the time that I was offered an opportunity to move from where we live here in the Bay Area. And I'm contemplating this idea. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do it, which is moving inland and moving east.
Yeah.
Which to me is carrying this feeling of being kind of safer and a little bit more tucked away.
Yeah.
We do actually live near the ocean here. Not that I think there's going to be a natural disaster, but this is just an area that has a lot more tension collectively,
Yeah.
and I think the feeling that that just having this opportunity rise in my consciousness is that something is calling me inland. And maybe even other people kind of need to disperse too, is kind of how it feels like as we gather, especially in the cities here, just with all the tension, that feels like a little bit of a pressure cooker.
Right.
So there's something that's really calling me. And the feeling is that I want other people to see it too. In fact, I want other people to come with me.
Yeah.
Yet that's probably not going to happen.
Well, this mythology in your unconscious really mirrors the mythology we were just discussing. Is this feeling that maybe you could just punch the wave and defeat it and save all these people?
Yeah.
Is something that you're kind of trying to do.
Right.
You want to warn them.
Yeah.
You're saying like, get out of the way, run. You want to defeat the wave almost if you could, but you can't.
No.
So what can you do? All you can do is run.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of guilt maybe that's associated with that. Is like you would like to help other people and you would like people to come with you.
Yeah.
But maybe you have no power there. And I think the stasis of the wave is interesting. I'm not really sure how to interpret that. I mean, it's so obvious if it's floating above you. It's like you want to say, look everyone, can't you see this huge thing? It's like it's there and it's bad and it's going to come crashing down. Like, why isn't anyone else running?
Yeah.
So there's maybe this perception that you are seeing and feeling something that the people that you care about or the people around you, or even strangers that you kind of just feel compassion towards in general, that they don't see what you see and they're in trouble and there's nothing you can do to help them.
Yeah.
And so there's like this powerlessness and impotence that is part of the dream.
Yeah, certainly there's like that feeling that there's nothing that I can do to help others in it. And I don't know. I think it's very interesting when you look at dreams and you start to sort of pull apart their themes. And I have had other dreams that are kind of similar to this, both like, there's this huge tidal wave and like it seems like it's going to come crash, and then it kind of hits and it's actually like this like light just like flowing of water at people's feet. But this is a little bit different, and the feeling, if I'm to like really lean into the kind of more subtle tones of this dream, is very deeply archetypal and taking me a little bit outside of myself. It's like a little bit personal. There are some other elements, but it feels very collective in nature.
Yeah.
And like my focus on recognizing the scene and the danger of the scene and that archetypal motif that's just so obvious in this really kind of speaks to that typical archetypal dream, which is that, yes, there's lots of personal material that's happening, but the unconscious is sort of like amplifying it to this higher place where maybe the considerations outside of just your own personal sphere of awareness and impact should also be considered as you kind of work to interpret the dream, which I don't know, what does that really say to me? It's like, I think sometimes people with the awareness that we have both internally but also externally do have these dreams that seem to speak to like a greater collective pattern. And very interesting phenomena as an example, when like the big world wars were happening or right before they really broke out, there are some really intense dreams, including Carl Jung had this like these like waves of like blood dreams where it was like something is crazy is going on. Something's about to happen. And then like World War I think broke out, or World War II. I'm not sure. I think it was one. But anyways, all of that is to say that there are times that when I think a more collective stream is sort of flowing through your dreams.
Yeah, well, there's definitely implicit patterns in the world that people are picking up on. We don't really pay much attention to this, obviously, because by definition, it's not something that you can really pay attention to, but like your body is paying attention to patterns. There's little things that you're noticing around you that are giving you signals that something is happening or something is going to change.
Yeah.
And if you are open to your intuition, if you're open to your gut level unconscious feelings and allowing it to express itself, which is, I think you are, for instance, more so than I am, because I'm heavily like consciousness fixated, which means I might be ignoring a lot of the implicit patterns going on around me. I think it's definitely possible that a lot of people can be picking up on the same invisible patterns that are speaking to something is coming. Though honestly, that feeling of like impending doom, it's like it's not really a secret, and it's not. If you are paying attention at all, you're going to see this. In fact, how could you not have this feeling? Like, is there really anyone out there who's just like, everything is fine? Or that meme, like, this is fine? Probably not. It's kind of hard to escape this notion of like, there's a lot of things converging right now. And how concrete is the end of days that people are feeling? Is it just panic?
Yeah.
And there's nothing behind it? Is it panic breeding more panic? Is it contagious? Is it people just losing their minds on Twitter and there's nothing actually behind it? Or is it something concrete that is approaching us that we can't make sense of, but we can feel it?
Right. Well, the interesting kind of little entry point into that topic of discussion, I think, is in the dream where I like turn to this person. I'm like, what happened? What's going on? And they say, the city has been taking like huge amounts of water out of the ocean. So like to me, it's like when I think back to this, it was something's being like siphoned out of the water. And specifically the person says like this natural balance, the natural order, which when we think about the flood myths, it's like, why is God angry? It's like something's been thrown off here.
Right.
And when that happens, especially by the hand of mankind, which is thought of sometimes as like we've been sinful in some way, like we've been acting in ways that are not virtuous. And sometimes that's, we think it's in service to something good, maybe in the development of our own culture or whatnot. But in reality, it's like we've maybe gotten a little bit out of relationship with that sense of virtue, of what is true and what is real. And there's some sort of dynamic of that in this dream, where my unconscious is using that symbol to say like some greater force is throwing off a balance here.
Right.
And people are kind of caught in it. They're sort of like fascinated by it, right? Like everyone's just transfixed, just staring at this.
Yeah.
And that's bringing that like impending doom.
Right. There's kind of a Tower of Babel thing going on when you bring that up. So you're saying the city is sort of messing with the natural order,
like
the balance of things.
Yeah.
And the city as like a collective. It's not just one individual.
Right. It's not even like it's the government.
Right.
Like it was just like the collective.
Right.
Yeah.
And the city is doing something. It's messing with something that it shouldn't be messing with. And it's sort of this hubristic, like, again, like Icarus thing, the height of the wave going upward. There is this feeling of like it's too tall, going like the Tower of Babel was going high up.
Don't fly too high.
Icarus is flying too high.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of this, but it's sort of the elevation of the wave. There is this feeling of like going way too high up, and like the higher up you go, the harder you are going to fall. And so the higher up this wave is going, the harder it's going to come crashing down. And with the Tower of Babel, it's like you're building this huge tower. It's a tower, and like, is anyone paying attention to like the idea that the tower might collapse? What's going to happen when the tower collapses? Like, it's the same thing with the wave. It's like, is anyone paying attention to how high this wave is going?
Yeah.
I am. It's like, what happens when it crashes? It's like, what are you talking about? Like, it's like we're in the wave and it's fun. Like, I'm just like surfing the wave. It's like, yeah, but what about when the wave comes down? It's like, not thinking about it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a play. Maybe that's a not in your unconscious, but that's the sins of the city, the sins of the society, of the collective, messing with nature and constructing something that should not be there.
Yeah.
But again, combined with like nature, like the wave is water, it's the ocean.
Yeah.
It's not like you're seeing like a giant like monster truck that's like
Right.
coming down over the city. It's like, well, that's humans building stuff. It's like it is still like the and maybe that ties into your unconscious. It's like maybe you feel the weight of your, gut level unconscious chaos that's going to flood over you if you don't leave. Maybe you're overwhelmed by the stress of being here. Maybe you're overwhelmed by all the conflict in your life.
Yeah. I think it can certainly be tapping into both like a subjective and objective level here, where it's like, how does this relate to me? In what ways have I felt like the natural order of my life has been thrown off? Why would I even be considering leaving my home if things were great, right? Because we're playing multidimensionally, which is good and important because dreams can be like that. It's like, how are these aspects all me? How have I been like building up something that needs to kind of crash down, which to me is like the decision to leave is throwing like everything out of sorts. Yet it feels like, as per the flood myth, this destruction will bring a new order, and I need to go inland. Like I need to follow that calling, like God, like something in me, that voice is urging me forward and is kind of, I'm not building an ark or anything like that, but I'm getting away before the floodwaters really come. So, I think both one foot in how I'm viewing like the collective experience and a commentary on that, you might say, and my own inner fears or projections, while at the same time representing this own internal dynamic.
Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.